For most of human history, the idea that we are not alone was just that, an idea. A subject of myths, religions, science fiction. It was something to wonder about, speculate on, but never to know. Then in recent years, something changed. A small handful of people started to push the idea that there was something more to this. Government agents, long accused of covering up the truth, started letting us have a peek behind the curtain. Then came the admissions, one after another. High-ranking officials, decorated pilots, even intelligence insiders stepping forward. They weren't talking about lights in the sky, swamp gas or mistaken weather balloons. They were talking about technology that defied our understanding of physics. And the real question wasn't just what these things were, but who was behind them. For decades, secrecy and stigma kept the truth buried, but now with each leak, each declassified document, each public statement from those inside the system, that truth is clawing its way to the surface. There are only a handful of possibilities. What has been reported is something natural, misidentified by countless pilots and members of militaries all around the world. Secondly, that this is man-made technology that is mind-blowingly advanced and that no one is owning up to creating. Or there is the third option. And if everything we've been told was wrong, if we're standing on the edge of a reality far bigger than we've ever imagined, are we ready to face it? Ever since the story in 2017 by the New York Times, there has been huge momentum towards the disclosure of what our governments know about UFOs, with videos being declassified and continuous outlandish claims being made by people who held prominent roles within the intelligence services. It feels like a subject that needs to be discussed even more than it already is. I had intended to make a serious video, talking about some of the more notable cases that have pushed the UFO disclosure movement forward, but then I thought, you know what sounds a lot more fun? I asked a few episodes ago if you all believed in the paranormal, but I've never asked if you believe in UFOs. If so, what do you think they are? Please let me know in the comments below your general thoughts on the topic, even if it's just a yes or no to signify if you believe or not. So let's get into it. Tonight we're going to cover everything from flowery robots to pancake-eating aliens, and maybe even a flying Bigfoot or two. Get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. Things are about to get very strange around here. In 1974, the phone began to ring in the offices of a Florida newspaper. It was operated by The Weekday, a paper based in West Palm Beach. The receptionist answered the phone to be greeted by an older woman on the other end. She was asking to speak to a reporter. She had a story that she was desperate to share. Something strange had happened to her when she was a young girl, something that she didn't feel comfortable talking about with anyone. But it was an experience that had stayed with her for 50 years at this point, and she had finally decided that it was important to share what she had seen, even if no one would believe her. The newspaper was apparently interested enough by what beauty salon manager Evelyn Wendt had to say, so they sent out a reporter to meet with her. When she laid out her 50-year-old secret, the reporter must have thought someone at his office was winding him up. This must be a joke. But as she continued on her story, the way she told it, something about it seemed to ring true. That despite how unbelievable it was, this woman seemingly believed that this event really happened. She was around 9 years old at the time it happened and living in Pasco County. Evelyn was alone playing outside her school, without a care in the world, until she noticed something. A bright light. But this light wasn't shooting through the sky, as in so many reports like this. No, this light was coming from the lawn, just a few feet away from her. Evelyn wasn't sure how long it had been there, but it had her attention now. A small egg-shaped light in the grass that was glowing so bright. It glowed with such an intensity that Evelyn believed it rendered her unconscious, at least momentarily, due to a sudden jump in her memory of what happened. The next thing she knew, the object wasn't glowing. at least not to the same veracity. What had been a blinding glowing egg now looked more like a traditional flying saucer, although of course at this time that may not have been so traditional. Evelyn noted that the saucer didn't look high-tech or sleek or futuristic. If anything, it looked old and beaten up. The little girl stood, almost hypnotised, as she claimed that a hatch on the side of the object opened, and that was when she saw them for the first time. The occupants of the ship began to walk out of the hatch in front of her. In Evelyn's own words, she described the scene as follows. "Little people emerged. I think they were robots. I tried to count them, but they changed about so. They were smaller than I was and resembled animated flowers with faces where the bud would be. Remember, I was just a bitty thing then. And kids don't fear flowers." The flower creatures were carrying some sort of object, lugging it between them. For some reason, Evelyn believed it was a weapon of some kind, and they appeared to be attempting to point it towards the science building of her school. Stranger still, Evelyn felt compelled not to run away and get help, but instead to assist these strange animated-looking flower creatures. The creatures were happy for her to do so, but despite the object being small, she found she couldn't move it an inch. She said she was desperate to help them. They seemed so small, so helpless, so innocent. Up until this moment, the creatures hadn't said a word. But after her attempt to help them, the beings apparently began to communicate with her, but their mouths didn't seem to move, if they had real mouths at all. Instead, Evelyn could hear their thoughts in her mind. They informed the little girl that there were experiments being carried out in her school's laboratory. Dangerous experiments. Experiments they had to put a stop to, or else the entire place would be destroyed. Evelyn told the reporter that she didn't know what these experiments could be. What could possibly be taking place in the 1920s Florida school that could be seen as so dangerous? But then, after putting the machine in place, nothing happened. Instead, without explaining to Evelyn why, they simply began to pick it back up and return it to the craft. She couldn't say if the machine had done anything, or if they had simply changed their minds. Maybe it was simply a test, to see if Evelyn would help them. One of the flower beings offered to take Evelyn inside the craft to show it to her, but in what was likely a sensible reaction, the little girl said she didn't want to. They seemed to understand this, but in a rather cryptic twist, they then said they would be back for her in 35 years' time. Before the hatch on the craft closed up once again, it then began to move. Evelyn described the ship's movement in her interview, saying, "All I can remember now is that the saucer was leaden looking and very pockmarked. Then when it started up, its molecules expanded and it turned silvery bright. The UFO then went straight up, hovered a minute and disappeared from sight." Curiously, Evelyn notes that sometime after this incident, the school's science building was in fact destroyed. She didn't know who or what had done it, but Evelyn doesn't explain when this happened, nor what she meant exactly by destroyed. Evelyn waited and waited, but the 35-year deadline came and went. She never did see her flowery friends again. Evelyn kept this story to herself ever since. She only decided to share it in the 70s because she felt that people were becoming more open to ideas about UFOs. In the 1920s, she didn't even know how to begin to explain what she had witnessed. None of it made any sense to her. After her interview, many people in the UFO field came to interview her to try and learn more. Many suspected that if her story were genuine, then she may be forgetting key details about what happened. The events felt disjointed, like parts were missing. An attempt was made to hypnotise her, to see if they could root out any suppressed memories, but seemingly this was not successful. It's hard to really dig too far into this tale. Evelyn was the only witness and her recounting sounds so fantastical that it is hard to believe. But the fact that this is so strange always just leaves that level of doubt in your mind, because it just feels like such a weird thing to make up. I also can't be the only one that noticed a certain level of similarity between this event and a certain clown from the Isle of Wight. If this really happened or not, at the very least Evelyn provided us with one of the strangest stories of UFOs ever reported, an account that is known to this day as the Dade City Flowers. The year was 1981 and it was a dark and quiet night. The sort of night where nothing really happens. A young man in his early 20s, identified only as PN, set out for his shift at a warehouse in Odense, Denmark. The roads were empty. The village of Asum was deadly silent this late at night. At precisely 2:10 AM, he left his home and began the familiar drive through the countryside. But as he reached a nearby forest-lined road, without warning his car's engine sputtered, coughed and died. The vehicle, however, continued rolling down the small hill, leading to a T-junction just further down the road. PN instinctively hit the brakes, bringing the car to a halt. He was shaken, panicked. This was a near miss and it could have ended much worse if the roads weren't so dead at this time. But as he tried to catch his breath, and before he even could begin to think about what was wrong with his car, he glanced up momentarily and saw it. 60 meters ahead, hovering in the cool night air just above the forest floor, was an impossibly bright light. It was a sphere 3 meters in diameter, glowing with an eerie yellow hue that bathed the surrounding trees in an otherworldly glow. And then he noticed, somewhere in the glowing light, there was something sticking out of it. From this floating orb, a ramp had extended to the ground. At the top sat what appeared to be an open door, revealing an interior that seemed less like a structure and more like an amorphous, swirling cloud of orange light. But his attention was quickly taken away from the doorway when he realised there were figures on the ground. PN's pulse quickened as he took in the bizarre scene. Near the ramp, 2 distinct groups of beings were at work. The first, a collection of 7 small greyish figures, no taller than a metre, moved with purpose, gathering soil and plant samples before handing them off to an unseen recipient inside the craft. Their bodies were unlike anything human, appearing almost geometric, like 2 triangles stacked on top of one another. Their heads, PN assumed, were the smaller of the 2 triangles. The second group was even more unsettling. 3 taller entities stood motionless, 2 stationed at the ramp's entrance and 1 positioned at its base. These beings, PN felt, were watching. Guardians. Sentinels. Unlike their smaller counterparts, they held strange devices, perhaps instruments, perhaps weapons. He wasn't sure. And while they possessed small stubby legs, they did not walk. Instead they hovered, gliding effortlessly over the ground. For a full minute, PN sat frozen in his car, struggling to process what he was witnessing. But then the story got stranger still, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. A taxi, parked next to the creek that was just off of the road. It sat in the darkness, its driver blinking the headlights in rapid succession. But who was the signal meant for? PN, or the beings? Heart pounding, PN turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life as if nothing had happened. In that same instant, the figures at the craft took notice, heads snapping towards him. Then, without warning, they moved. They advanced towards him with a terrifying speed, their bodies gliding over the ground in perfect, unnatural synchronization. Panic set in. Before he had time to think, PN threw the car into gear and tore away, speeding past the T-junction, following the taxi as it executed a sharp 180-degree turn and bolted towards Odense. The road blurred as he pushed the accelerator to its limit, trees whipping past on either side. After roughly 150 meters, he dared to glance in the rearview mirror. They were standing on the bridge. The figures had stopped, watching him go. Seconds later, a bend in the road swallowed them from view. He looked forward, but the taxi driver was long gone. When PN arrived at work, shaken and breathless, he realised something strange. He was early. The fear-fueled drive had made him faster than ever before. But no matter how many times he replayed the night's events in his mind, the same question haunted him. What had he stumbled upon? As soon as his shift finished, curiosity overcame fear. He returned to the site, scanning the ground for any sign of what he had seen. Burn marks, disturbed earth, anything. But there was nothing. The forest was still, unmarked, as if the night before had been nothing more than a fever dream. Except, it wasn't. PN kept his secret for years. He told only his family, hesitant to share what he had seen, a common occurrence with many of the witnesses in tonight's stories. It wasn't until 1996, more than a decade later, that the truth finally surfaced. His mother, who along with her husband had also experienced a strange encounter involving a UFO stopping their car, tipped off Scandinavian UFO information, or SUFOI, that's what we're going with for that acronym. 2 investigators were sent to the family home, interviewing PN in depth after discovering the family apparently had more than one experience. His conviction was unwavering. He knew what he had seen, even if he didn't know what that was. He also revealed something unexpected. Since that night, he had developed a kind of precognitive ability, although he didn't seem to give much detail on how this worked exactly. Just the suggestion that on some occasions, he was able to see things before they happened. Was there a connection to the entities? He didn't know. The SUFOI team travelled to the location of the sighting, retracing PN's steps, examining the location for themselves, but the passage of time had erased any trace of the event. Not that, according to PM, there was any trace to begin with. They attempted to track down additional witnesses, particularly the unknown taxi driver, even placing a personal ad in a local paper, but no one came forward. Despite a lack of evidence, both investigators were convinced that PN's experience was genuine, even if they couldn't say for certain what he had experienced. The Asum Encounter remains one of the strangest reports of alien beings ever documented, their triangular features making it stand out as a rather unique sighting. To this day, PN's account stands as one of Denmark's most compelling and chilling UFO cases. What did PN see that night? Who was in the taxi? Did the beings ever come back? Perhaps somewhere out there, the Guardians are still watching him. Okay, we're going to be taking a break from aliens momentarily, because if you believe certain stories, there is something else unexplainable flying through our skies that could be much more dangerous. The Flying Bigfoot. It was the summer of 2005, late June to be precise, when an ordinary drive home turned into something utterly extraordinary. The witness, who has remained nameless, was driving a small Mazda along Highway 12 northeast from Walla Walla when he first caught sight of something unusual out of the corner of his eye. Initially dismissing it as a large plastic bag caught in the wind, he continued on, only vaguely aware of the anomaly hovering in the sky to his right. As he neared Way Station 51 just past the Walla Walla airport, the situation took an uncanny turn. He got a clearer look at it now. The object was no bag. It had form, movement, and most strikingly, a humanoid shape. It floated above the power lines, drifting east to west, its silhouette now unmistakably defined. Curiosity overtook him. He pulled over beside the guardrail, stepping out of his car to get a clearer look. What he saw defied explanation. Suspended in mid-air, the figure glided effortlessly across the landscape, seemingly toward a distant hill. The witness, now gripped with adrenaline, rushed back to his vehicle, determined to follow. desperate to figure out what he was looking at. Speeding towards Sapperlil Road, he took a sharp left, hoping to get ahead of the entity. As he rounded the bend, he saw it again. The figure was still there, now just a half-mile away. It manoeuvred with eerie precision, rarely deviating from the straight line it was travelling in, as though it were focused on a singular point. It seemed to be headed towards an old silo up the hill. At a remote four-way intersection, the witness came to a halt, stepping out of his car once more. This time the being was closer than ever, no more than 50 yards away, and hovering roughly 20 feet off the ground. Now he could make out even more unsettling details. And this is where it gets really odd. The figure was massive, standing an estimated 12 feet tall. It moved as if supported by an unseen force, floating rather than walking. Beneath it, a strange device that he described as akin to 3 red hippity-hop balls, tethered together, that he believed seemed to serve as its mode of propulsion. The being's legs were as wide as 2 of those spheres, and hung motionless. And then, the most disturbing detail of all, it appeared that a dead dog dangled from its side, tied with a rope, its lifeless body swaying in the air. Then, whatever this thing was, seemed to notice that the witness was looking at it, and it too looked back. As the entity turned, it did so in an unnatural way. Its head, covered in thick hair, remained fixated on the witness, even as its body changed direction, its neck rotating like that of an owl. He had no idea what he was seeing. It was almost impossible to describe. Determined to keep it in sight, he jumped back in his car, racing down Smith Road. But the creature was already moving lower, dipping below the treetops of a nearby forested area. He sped forward, trying to regain visual contact, but by the time he rounded the final bend, it was gone, vanished into the wilderness. Reflecting on what he had witnessed, one comparison stood out above all others. He said it looked exactly like the legendary figure captured in the Patterson Gimlin film of 1967, but this being didn't simply walk, it floated through the sky. Now, from a distance at least, the most obvious suggestion is that this was simply some oddly shaped balloon. The description of its movement sounds very balloon-like, but the details about the witness getting closer to it are genuinely nightmarish. This hairy Bigfoot-esque creature that moved in an owl-like way but was apparently carrying a dead dog below it tied with ropes, as though it was something in between natural and man-made. The witness couldn't say for sure what he had seen, but one thing was certain. Something strange was happening in the skies over Walla Walla that summer night. I was very intrigued by this story. While again there isn't much to go on regarding evidence, I was so excited about the idea of a flying Sasquatch. That was until the good folks from the fantastic channel The In-Between told me that they had covered a similar case before, and that was when I learned that there is a cryptid that has been spotted numerous times over the years, and that this cryptid bears some similarities to what this witness saw. So let's just quickly look at a few of those examples. What is most commonly referred to as the first sighting of this creature is from the 1980s. Following the May 18th, 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington, there were unverified reports of a winged creature resembling a monkey with red eyes, flying through the volcanic plume. Then, on April 19th, 1994, at approximately 9:30 p.m, 18-year-old Brian Canfield was driving his truck near Buckley, Washington, in the foothills of Mount Rainier. Suddenly, his vehicle inexplicably stalled. As he attempted to restart it, a large creature landed about 30 feet ahead on the road. Canfield described it as standing 9 foot tall, covered in bluish fur with a wolf-like face, yellow eyes, tufted ears, sharp white teeth, and large wings folded against its back. The creature reportedly stared at him for several minutes, before unfurling its wings and taking off with enough force to shake the truck. Afterwards, the vehicle restarted, and Canfield drove away. He later returned to the site with his mother and a neighbour, but found no evidence of the encounter. Local reporter C.R. Roberts interviewed Canfield and said he found him to be sincere despite his unusual claims. The same year, a man named Butch Whitaker claimed he had pictures of the creature that was now being referred to as Batsquatch, but he never did provide these, not leading too many people to believe his claims. Sightings continued sporadically around the country over the following decades. In 2009, hikers near Mount Chatash in California reported witnessing a massive creature with leathery wings, estimated to have a wingspan of 50 feet, emerging from a crevice in the mountain. Initially, one witness likened its head to that of a pterodactyl, but later compared it to a flying fox. Apparently the creature had moved away from the Washington area. In June 2011, an individual who did not want to be identified reported observing a large flying creature while in his yard walking his dog. He described it as having bat-like wings, blue fur, and glowing red eyes, standing approximately 9 feet tall. The creature reportedly flew away shortly after being spotted, and as recent as 2014, the creature was spotted in Ohio, a place with numerous apparent sightings. In this example, students in a second period Spanish class at Archbishop Hoban High School in Akron claimed to have seen a giant black mass approximately 9 feet tall, with a wingspan of 20 to 30 feet, swiftly flying past their classroom window. So when people tell you to keep an eye on the skies, it's not UFOs we should be worried about. Instead, it's those damn dirty 9-foot bat apes. On a cold Valentine's Day morning in 1967, Claude Edwards, a no-nonsense farmer from Tuscumbia, Missouri, found himself at the centre of a very strange encounter. As he prepared to tend to his daily chores, he stepped outside and immediately sensed something was off. Edwards was walking closer and closer to his barn when he noticed that the farm was oddly silent. The animals weren't making a noise. Then he glanced to his right to see the cows in the field next to him. His cattle, huddled together in the eastern field, were all staring in the same direction, fixated on something beyond his barn. Following their gaze, Edward's eyes landed on an astonishing sight. A massive mushroom-shaped object sat in the adjacent meadow. The structure, a dull greyish green, stood atop a sort of tube-like base. Edwards couldn't look away, but he continued towards the barn, not taking his eyes off this strange object as he did, setting down his feed bucket and securing the doors before turning back towards the peculiar craft. It was then that he noticed them. It wasn't just this weird structure, there was something else in his field. He saw a group of small figures moving frantically beneath the structure. From his vantage point, roughly 70 feet away, he observed the beings with keen detail. They were short, no taller than 3 feet, and shared the same greyish-green hue as their craft. Their large, wide-set black eyes, that Edwards did admit could have been goggles instead of actual eyes, gave them an unsettling appearance. Edwards was also struck by the speed at which they moved. Their lower limbs were obscured, so he didn't get a good look at those, and they flailed their arms around, making it difficult to determine whether they had hands. Some dark protrusion, perhaps Edwards suggested a breathing apparatus, jutted out from where their nose and mouths should have been. He would later infamously go on to describe them as green penguins from outer space. In what I think is a slightly unusual move for a UFO witness, but also in some ways understandable, Edwards became irate that these strange penguin people were on his land. These unknown intruders had spooked his cattle and invaded his farm, and he wasn't about to stand idly by. Without hesitation, he climbed over the first fence. He picked up the biggest rocks he could find and started marching towards the beings, apparently with the intention of throwing rocks at the UFO, not to scare them away, but he said to damage it enough that it couldn't take off. As he closed the gap to just 15 feet, something inexplicable happened. He hit an invisible wall. There was no tangible barrier, nothing he could see or feel, yet he was completely unable to move forward. Now at close range, Edwards took in the finer detail of the craft. The domed top spanned about 18 feet across with an apex height of about 8 feet. The hull was metallic yet oddly soft looking, as if crafted from a seamless, futuristic material. Along its surface were evenly spaced out oval cutouts, each about a foot wide, and they emitted pulsating, multicoloured light. It was not clear whether these were windows or some form of illumination, but they cast a mesmerising shifting glow. After getting a good look at it, Edwards retreated a little, hoisted a heavy rock and hurled it towards the craft. The stone struck the unseen force field, ricocheted away harmlessly, and dropped to the ground without a sound. Unwilling to accept defeat, he lobbed a second rock, only to meet the same result. The creatures beneath the craft immediately responded, retreating behind the tube structure at the base of the ship, seemingly using this to re-enter it. Then, without warning, the entire craft shifted, tilting towards him, then tilted again in another direction. On the third tilt, it lifted up from the ground, rising effortlessly into the sky. There was no visible propulsion, no sound of engines, nothing to explain how it moved. It simply floated up silently into the sky. As Edward stood frozen in awe, the ship ascended at a breathtaking speed before levelling out and darting northeast, disappearing in the direction of St. Elizabeth. The entire experience lasted all of 10 minutes, but it was one that would haunt Edwards for the remainder of his life. He had apparently chased off aliens with some rocks. What follows makes the whole story even more intriguing to me. Edwards didn't really tell anyone about it other than his family. His brother was insistent though, that this was important, and that he needed to share his experience, no matter how it may make him look. Edwards rightly assumed that he would face ridicule for this. He had seen what he described as space penguins hanging out underneath a metallic mushroom. This was not the sort of reputation the farmer wanted in his local community, but his brother contacted UFO investigator Ted Phillips and pleaded with his brother to speak to the man. After a fair amount of back and forth, he finally agreed to it, as long as Phillips didn't reveal Edwards' identity. Edwards did later give a couple of small interviews, but it seems he requested these to be anonymous too. The full account of his space penguin encounter was only published after Edwards passed away, leaving behind a legacy that saw him nearly start an intergalactic war with space penguins. On the morning of April 18th, 1961, Joe Summerton, a 54-year-old plumber living just outside Eagle River, Wisconsin, had an encounter unlike any other. According to Joe, he was washing dishes around 11 AM when an unexpected noise caught his attention. A sound he described as reminiscent of screeching car tires rounding a sharp curve. Looking outside, he was startled to see a metallic object descending from the sky, moving vertically like an elevator. At first he thought something had happened to his roof, but the unfamiliar brightness of the object told him otherwise. Rushing outside for a better look, he saw a gleaming, chrome-like craft hovering just above his driveway. The structure, roughly 30 feet wide and 12 feet high, resembled two inverted bowls pressed together, another traditional flying saucer appearance. Without making contact with the ground, the object remained suspended in the air. As Joe stood watching, a hatch on the craft opened, revealing a figure no taller than 5 feet. The being had a dark complexion which Joe likened to someone of Italian descent. Its face was smooth and hairless, and a tight-fitting cap covered its head. It gestured to him, mimicking the act of drinking water, before handing him a metallic container with side handles. Joe looked into the being's eyes, but he said they were so penetrating that he had to look away. There was something unnerving about its presence, but for some reason Joe didn't seem to be afraid exactly. Joe took the container inside his home, filled it from his basement water pump, and returned it to the waiting figure. As he did, he steadied himself against the craft with his other hand. Many have reported burns and other such phenomena from coming into close contact with UFOs like this, but when later asked about possible burns or unusual effects from touching the surface, he reported nothing out of the ordinary. The being took the container of water. Joe mentioned that he still struggled to look at it for some reason, but when he did, he said it was like it was looking straight through him. He was convinced it knew what he was thinking, not instinctively, but as though it could read his mind. Looking inside the craft, Joe noticed two additional figures, both clad in seamless dark hooded tunics. They appeared to be engaged in specific tasks, strapped in by what looked like safety belts. One was at a control panel, while the other worked over a heated, grill-like device that produced smoke but no visible flames. Curious about what they were cooking, Joe made a gesture as if he was eating. They seemed to understand him. In response, the being that had been standing in the doorway walked off and then scooped up several small, round objects from the grill and handed them to Joe. They resembled pancakes, but their texture was odd, hot and greasy, and perforated with small holes. Taking a bite, Joe found the taste to be like eating cardboard, later remarking that if this was their primary food source, it might explain their small stature. Before departing, the being in the hatch performed an unfamiliar gesture, touching its forehead momentarily before shutting the door. Joe, interpreting it as a salute, returned the motion, saying in a later interview what else was he supposed to do. Once sealed, the hatch left no visible seam, as if it had never been there. Moments later, the craft rose about 20 feet, tilted at a 45-degree angle, and shot off at an incredible speed, leaving behind only a disturbed pine tree that swayed violently but showed no lasting damage. Left standing in his driveway with a handful of greasy pancakes, Joe was overwhelmed by what had just transpired. The bizarre nature of his story attracted both curiosity and ridicule. Investigators were skeptical, but noted that Simonton himself seemed sincere and had little to gain from fabricating such an account. He was frustrated by the public's reaction, although weirdly particularly being labelled as a chicken farmer, when he only raised chickens as a side business. He was actually a plumber by trade, and he claimed that the story stopped him from getting work. Many people didn't want to hire the Pancake Alien guy. Interestingly though, after the encounter, 23 of Joe's chickens died, all passing away quickly after the visitors had been to the farm. Joe kept a few of the strange pancakes, and later showed them to Judge Franklin Carter, a local UFO enthusiast. Carter, intrigued by the claim, arranged for further analysis. One of the samples was eventually sent to the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, a civilian UFO research group led by retired Marine Major Donald Kehoe. Though NICAP initially claimed that they did not analyse the sample, conflicting reports suggest it was tested, revealing it to be made of simple earthly ingredients, primarily buckwheat flour. The NICAP group were seemingly hesitant to get too involved in this case, feeling it was too silly and that people wouldn't take it seriously. Despite skepticism, Joe wasn't alone. Additional reports emerged from the same day. A local insurance agent, Savino Borgo, claimed to have seen an unidentified flying object in the area. Another resident, Phyllis Lobetsky, along with her 3 children, also reported seeing the craft. Joe kept to his story, and it's a case that has resonated with many over the years for I think 2 major reasons. 1, it is just such an unusual account, and 2, Joe just seems so genuine. You can see his interview on YouTube from the time, and he just comes across as such a normal guy. No one knows for certain what's happened to Joe in his driveway in 1961, but for many it remains the strangest UFO encounter ever recorded. A plumber gifted extraterrestrial pancakes, penguin-like visitors from beyond the stars, a winged Bigfoot soaring over the wilderness, each tale more impossible than the last, and yet each told with conviction, each wrapped up in a haze of mystery that refuses to fade. Are these stories the results of misidentifications, wild imaginations, or something that slinks just beyond our understanding? The next time you're alone in a quiet road, the next time you hear a strange noise in the night, remember, there are those who swore that they saw something impossible, and maybe, just maybe, you are about to become one of these people. That's all for this entry into the tape library. I was genuinely planning on doing something on the disclosure movement, but I've had a bunch of cases that people have asked me to tackle over the last year or so that just didn't really have enough meat to them for a whole episode on their own, so I thought combining a bunch into one topic could be a fun way to tackle this one. Thank you to everyone who suggested the likes of the Dade City Flowers and the Pancake Aliens. These strange little events are always favourites of mine to talk about. Plus, after a few really intense episodes in terms of writing and research, it was fun to just listen to plumbers talking about aliens for a bit. Just want to add that the conversations going on at the moment surrounding UAPs are extremely interesting, and I think they are important. This episode was in no way intended to make light of that movement. This was just intended to be a fun exploration of some of the weirder stories that are out there. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please do let me know in the comments. Click the like button and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help me out massively. I'm going to be taking a very short break while I wrap up some work projects that exist outside of the tape library. So the next episode will be the long-awaited Volume 8 of our Scary Stories to Fall Asleep To series. These are normally compilations of previous stories I've covered, but with minimal ads. But for this one, I'm hoping to record a handful of brand new stories to include as well. So hopefully there will be something for everyone there. But never fear, I will be back in April with a brand new deep dive, which, if all goes to plan, will be another one that was requested by one of you, and it's a really creepy one. If you want to support the show, you can do that through YouTube memberships and Patreon. So let's now do those Patreon shoutouts. These are the wonderful people who keep the lights on in the tape library archives. Our tape library archivists Umiko Grimm, Sandy Lusk, Restock1731, Mirror, Judith Hacker, Gabrielle, Eric Salas, Destiny M, Ashlar's Books, Dagon Odorleg, Dirtnap6969, Lady Bet Noir, Adeline, Peter McCann, Jolly Jedi, Crimson DM, Harrison Still, Juno, Georgia Harvey, Dominic Giangelis, Dean J. Daly, Jay, Joe, Sad Girl Callie, Darla, G-Raw, Midia Zabine, Montana Martin, Sirius Whack the Detective, Emmy Bartley, Alfredo Sandoval and Tucker RVB, the lead archivist Van Yeol, Brian Baker, Old Soul Like Mine, Law William, Tracy Torello, Xavier Angle, Tyler Michael, Ridiculous, 1000th Ghost, London Grace, Melissa Harrison, Creepy Candy, Plague Doctor is in, Amy Stubblefield, Alex O'Neill and Alex Goldberg, and our extremely generous Grand Overseers, Morning Rain 2619, Katie, Agent 355, Leah Carmella, and Bad Diddley. Thank you all for your continued support, and to you for making it to the end of the episode. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.